And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome from St. Louis, Missouri, and the home of the Missouri Institute of Mental Health. My name's Tom Pansella with MIMH. Thanks for taking the time to join us this afternoon for this program on HEARTH and Housing. And I will introduce you in just a moment to someone who is not Liz Hager-Mace, and he'll explain why he's not and why she owes him a favor now. This program is, of course, sponsored by the Missouri Department of Mental Health as part of their transformation process. You might see a number of these programs popping up on our schedule in the very near future. But for those of you who are interested in CEUs for today's program, there is a link under the video window for the CEUs. If you have questions or comments anytime during the program, and I do mean anytime because we will interrupt with questions if you've got them, use that chat window right underneath the video window. Type next to the word say, type your comment, type your question, hit say. You should not have to log in. If you hit the button that says chat and it asks you to log in, you got the wrong button. So hit that say button. The first time you do that, you probably have to give yourself a nickname, and then we'll feed those questions or comments on your behalf from this end. Also, if you'd like to see the slides as a pop-up, as a PDF, there's a link to that under the video window as well. There's one more link there as well, because this is a Department of Mental Health program and because we do so much of our work for DMH. There is a link to the Spring Training Institute registration form and webpage down there as well. So you're perfectly welcome to explore that webpage and take a look and attend that program as well. And so I'd like to introduce Dirk Cable, not Liz Hager-Mace. And Dirk has worked for the DMH housing programs for 7 years. He manages around $5 million annually in HUD funds that house homeless, disabled persons and DMH sheltered plus care programs in the Kansas City area and on the western side of our state. He also manages the DMH housing unit's program documentation and online presence via its website and blog. Prior to working for DMH, he worked for the Missouri Association for Social Welfare, helping to set up the Homeless Management Information System for the balance of state continuum of care. Dirk's worked in the regulatory and legal realms in Missouri and California since 1984, having worked for a well-known legal publishing house, the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services, and for the Missouri Secretary of State's office. Dirk, thanks for stepping in today, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm obviously not Liz Hager-Mace. Liz couldn't be here today because she became a grandmother for the first time, I think about 3 in the morning yesterday. So if you know Liz, give a little cheer because she's a grandma and she's very proud and very happy, and mother and daughter are doing very well from what I understand. So today we're here to talk about the HEARTH Act and DMH housing programs and how the two fit together. And if you're tuning in, you probably already have heard a lot about the HEARTH Act. You've probably been hearing about it for the last 3 years, like the rest of us have. So it's finally, a good portion of it has finally come out in federal regulations as of January 5th. And we're here to talk about that and how that affects Department of Mental Health Shelter Plus Care programs. Obviously not presented by Liz Hager-Mace. I'm Dirk Cable, Department of Mental Health. Okay. So what we're going to talk about is the implementation of the HEARTH Act and how that's come about. A big part of that is the new HUD definitions of homelessness that came out effective January 5th of this year. I think it's caused a bit of stir around the state probably. And finally, how the HEARTH Act affects specifically Department of Mental Health Shelter Plus Care HUD-funded programs. You probably know what the HEARTH Act is if you're tuning in, but just in case, HEARTH is an acronym. It stands for Homeless Emergency Assistance and Rapid Transition to Housing. And the purpose of the HEARTH Act is multiple. A big part of it is it reauthorizes and consolidates the HUD McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance programs, and we'll talk about that some more. Consolidates them in theory into one big program. Revises, as we've seen, the HUD definition of homelessness to be consistent with definitions that other federal agencies have been using for a number of years. It establishes priorities for homeless prevention, permanent housing, families, and solving rural homelessness. And it continues to pay a lot of attention to the problems of chronic homelessness, and it's also added families to the existing definition of chronic homelessness, which, as you probably all know, has always meant a single individual. They've actually added families to that definition now. The history behind the HUD McKinney-Vento Act and the HEARTH Act goes back to 1987 with the original Stuart B. McKinney Homeless Assistance Act. It was reauthorized in 1992 into the form that we've all been working with or know of since then, basically. And in 1992, HUD also established the concept of the continuum of care process and the homeless management information system. Two things which have hugely affected, of course, what HUD grantees do and how homelessness prevention and amelioration has been approached nationwide since that time. And with the 92 reauthorization, what we had was ESG, which used to stand for Emergency Shelter Grant Program. With the HEARTH Act, that's now Emergency Solutions Grant Program. The three permanent housing programs and the homeless assistance programs, supportive housing program, or SHP, shelter plus care, and the Section 8 moderate rehabilitation program. There's also in there the PATH program, which is, programs to assist transition from homelessness. And this has also all affected schools in that the HEARTH Act has mandated that HUD grantees now have to ensure that children in homeless programs are connected properly with educational resources. That means making sure that they are allowed to continue to attend the school of their origin and not have to be, uprooted and go to a different school, and that they have to be connected with the school district's homeless coordinator. Among the permanent housing programs, shelter plus care is the one DMH is primarily concerned with. We only have shelter plus care programs, and what shelter plus care is, if you don't know, is permanent housing. It provides rental assistance for the hardest to serve homeless populations who are disabled, and it has to be in connection with supportive services to treat those disabilities. Supportive housing program is somewhat similar. It's often transitional in nature, also permanent, as requested by the successful grantee. Promotes the development of supportive housing and services that help homeless persons transition from homelessness to living as independently as possible. And the Section 8 moderate rehabilitation program, not often used. I think I only know of one instance in the entire state of Missouri where it's been used, and I believe in St. Louis. Provides Section 8 rental assistance in buildings which have undergone moderate rehabilitation to create SRO units, which meaning single room occupancy units. What happens is a PHA then uses their Section 8 vouchers to pay for people to live in those units. So among those three programs, the HEARTH Act, what it intends to do is consolidate them all into one program, which is a pretty huge change, in my opinion, having worked with these for a few years. It'll be one big single continuum of care program. And that hasn't happened yet. What HUD has said informally in various notices is the rules for that are going to come down in the next NOFA, i.e. the next notice of funding available for these programs. So the impact, one of the biggest impacts of the HEARTH Act on the continuum of care process is we used to have three distinct and very separate programs, as you see in the old COC programs on the left there. They're all going to become one big program with one big pot of money. You'll have a single continuum of care program, which includes all the eligible activities of the three former programs. That'll allow for more flexibility for mixing and matching the eligible activities in those programs. The HEARTH Act explicitly specifies rehousing, i.e. rapid rehousing, the kind of activities which took place under the HPRP program recently as an eligible activity. In effect, introducing prevention into the mix, which we never had before. And the admin fee for these programs, which has been 5% for SHP and 8% for shelter plus care, is supposed to go up to 10%. That is the law. That hasn't happened yet either, and probably won't until issues about federal deficits and budgetary matters on the federal level are resolved in a more effective way, because obviously if you up the admin fee, that's going to cost the government more money, and that's not going to happen right now. HEARTH Act also allows for reasonable cost for staff training, and that's continuum of care staff, which is also a first. The funding for the continuum of care process will continue to be a competitive process. It's not a block grant, of course, like, say, Community Development Block Grant or CDBG. And by competitive, it's competitive within each continuum, and then each continuum is essentially competing against each other nationwide for these funds. The amount of funds available are based on the pro rata need of each continuum. That's a formula that figures what the need is based on the amount of population and what the poverty rate is within that population in the continuum. Renewals for programs under the continuum care process do not count against, well, I should back up. Shelter plus care renewals don't currently count against the pro rata need. Under the HEARTH Act, that's going to change, where, since it'll all be one program, none of the cost of any of those programs under the HEARTH Act would count against the pro rata need. So that's good news for continuums whose money is being eaten up by renewals for supportive housing programs and other programs. It'll remain non-competitive. Yes, is there a question?
There's a question that has come in, actually. Somebody is not familiar with, and so maybe you could explain a little better, rehab.
Oh, the moderate rehab program. I don't know a whole lot about it myself personally, because, as I said, I believe there's only been one such program so far ever in Missouri, which I think is the Mark Twain Hotel in St. Louis. What happens is HUD provides the funding to, as they put it, moderately rehab an existing building. So we're not talking gutting the building entirely. Would probably have to be an existing, either a hotel-like building or, say, a nursing home or something like that, whereby it creates a single-room apartment, basically, or a series of them within the building, and a public housing authority, would have to be a public housing authority, not a nonprofit agency, for instance, would then partner with the grantee to provide Section 8 vouchers, which would fund the rent for people living in that building. And I believe people in those buildings have to be disabled too. I'm not 100% sure about that. Like I said, I'm not an expert. If Liz were here, she'd have a definite answer, I'm sure. But I hope that answers the question. That's about all I know about that program. It's like I said, it is not used very much, at least not in Missouri. So, Department of Mental Health shelter plus care programs. We've been doing this since about 1994. We've grown from, when I started, we had 23 grants. We currently have 40 grants that cover a good part of the state. We have grants in 7 of the 8 continua of care in Missouri. The total worth of the programs is a little over $16 million currently. And we are housing generally around 2,500 households at any given time throughout the state. I don't know how well you can see this map. The colors are the keys. If you can focus on the counties with the gold colors and the blue, those are the counties where we have shelter plus care available. So you can see it's a pretty good chunk of the state. Those counties with the light green colors are counties that we have another state-funded program which we call the Rental Assistance Program, which is a much, much smaller program in scope than shelter plus care, but it works in a similar manner to shelter plus care. Those counties in green and gold have access to the RAP program as well. So we have nearly all the counties in the state are covered by some form of rental assistance that the department provides. So the big thing lately with the HEARTH Act, HUD promulgated regs effective January 5th of 2012, redefining homelessness, and that's what we've been talking about for the last 3 years, ever since the HEARTH Act was approved. That was to have occurred according to congressional mandate within 6 months of the law being passed. That was back in May of 2009. Obviously that didn't happen in 6 months. And in the meantime, the definition of homelessness has been changing bit by bit here and there, mostly through the process of the NOFA, the Notice of Funding Available. For instance, as far as shelter plus care goes, they've introduced the concept of families as being chronically homeless. That's new. And sometime back, they for the category of people exiting institutions who are homeless, they increased the time that people could have been in those institutions from 30 to 90 days, just as an example. And they also changed definitions as they applied to the ESG programs and SHP as well. And as I said, the new homeless definition went into effect actually January 4th, not the 5th, of 2012. Yes.
We do have another question come in as well. Currently, not all COCs receive funding for all three programs, the SHP, the S+C, or the moderate rehab. With the consolidation of programs, does this mean that the COC recipient will be eligible for all three programs?
Well, I mean, I guess people are always, as far as, because based on what kind of entity they are, I would imagine. I don't know, because there are limitations currently. For instance, shelter plus care, you have to be a government entity or a public housing authority to apply for shelter plus care, but nonprofits can apply for supportive housing program. So I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, I think you had also mentioned that the moderate rehab was not eligible, not wide open either.
No. That is through a public housing agency only. And, I just don't know the answer to that question. But I'm assuming that those limitations are still going to be in place in some way. We can find out if we have the contact for this for the asker. We can get back to them on it, because I just don't know the answer. That's a good question, though, because obviously if you combine all three programs into one big program, how do you reconcile these limitations that they've had in the past on who can apply for the programs? So even though the definition is in effect, not all agencies will be able to use it fully. It depends on, what we have here, what year the grant was first funded, and what type of homeless assistance program we're talking about. A big thing is that for permanent housing programs, HUD, kind of subsequent to the new definition being made public, they also stated, in effect, by the way, because of the content of the 2011 NOFA, the new definition only applies to permanent housing programs to the extent that people still have to be in a core homeless situation. And we'll get to that a bit more in a moment, but that's a huge limitation on the implementation of the new definition. For instance, all 40 of the Department of Mental Health shelter plus care programs, none of them can fully implement that new definition for that reason that I just said. But for instance, what year the grant was funded affects it, because if you're a grantee with a program that is not in renewal status, i.e. it's still in its first 5 years or 3 years, the new definition does not apply to those grants. It has to be in a renewal status, i.e. in a 1-year grant period. And so what type of homeless assistance programs the definition applies to, as I kind of have introduced the concept, permanent housing programs such as shelter plus care and supportive housing programs, which are permanent housing, cannot fully implement the definition, and we'll get into that more specifically here in a moment. Let me just get to the next slide. It'll show it. The new definition is divided into 4 categories. Category 1 is basically the same definition that we've all been using since 1992, although that's changed over time. But in effect, it means people who are sleeping in a place not meant for human habitation, people who are in shelters and transitional housing programs, and people who have been living in an institution for 90 days or less, who are homeless prior to coming into that institution, and plus they're exiting that institution right now. All these programs, which you can see on your screen, ESG, SHP supportive services only, SHP transitional, SHP permanent housing, and shelter plus care, they can all use this definition. But this definition is no different from what any of us have been using for a number of years, so nothing has really changed there. Category 2 is new in the new HEARTH Act definition. Those folks or households who will lose their primary nighttime residence within 14 days. They have no subsequent residence identified, and they have no resources or support network in which to find replacement housing. And as you'll see in the next 3 categories, this applies to all the next 3. People in this situation cannot be considered homeless for any permanent housing program. People in ESG or who are being served by ESG programs, supportive housing program, supportive services only, and supportive housing transitional all can use this new part of the definition. So people in supportive housing permanent and shelter plus care cannot use this new definition or this new part of the definition. Category 3, similar. What it encompasses is unaccompanied youth, and youth is defined as people 24 and under, and families with children or youth who don't qualify under any other of the categories in the new definition, but who are considered homeless under categories defined in other federal statutes. And our website has a list of those statutes, and we'll see what that website is at the end here. Those households must not have had a lease ownership interest or occupancy agreement in any permanent housing anytime during the past 60 days. They must have moved 2 or more times during the past 60 days, and they can be expected to continue in this status for an extended period of time because of any special needs or barriers that they have. Again, this only applies to ESG, supportive services only programs, and SHP transitional. Permanent housing programs cannot use this definition. And the 4th category is people or households fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence. We used to have this category years ago, and HUD did away with it as a qualifying situation for, at least for shelter plus care. And they have re-added it back in the HEARTH Act. But again, the same applies as in the prior 2 categories. Only permanent housing programs such as shelter plus care and permanent supportive housing cannot use this definition. Again, only ESG, supportive housing, supportive programs, supportive services only, and supportive housing program transitional can take advantage of this. And fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence includes fleeing sexual violence, stalking, a number of situations. It's not purely what one might think of as domestic violence. They really broadened that definition quite a bit. So those include people for whom that's true. They have to have no subsequent residence identified, and they must have no resources or support networks to obtain replacement housing. So eligibility for shelter plus care, Department of Mental Health shelter plus care programs pretty much remains the same. People who count as homeless, well, households and persons who count as homeless, and of course they have to be adults, they must be at least 18 or over. And again, homelessness in this case still remains. People essentially living on the street in places not meant for human habitation, people in shelters, people in transitional programs who came from homelessness, and people in institutions who came from homelessness. Yes, Tom?
All right, got a couple questions that have come in here.
Okay.
So currently we use the chronically homeless, the CH definition, for our SHPTH program. Is the CH definition being replaced with these 3 categories?
As far as chronic homelessness, the only change in the chronic definition is the addition of families. So you should, it depends on if your program is in renewal status or not. If it's still in its initial funding period, then I don't believe the definition will have changed for you. But if it's in renewal status, and I think SHP are typically for 3 years at the start, if you're past that point, then the new chronic definition, including families, should apply to your program. And if it's, as you said, it's a transitional supportive housing program, I think you said, then yes, all of these new categories should apply to the extent that chronically homeless people can encompass any of that. But a lot of that is exclusive to chronic homelessness, because chronically homeless people still have to be on the street, quote unquote, or in shelters. So a lot of that doesn't apply to chronic homelessness inherently.
There's some clarification here. We are in the renewal status, and our TH program is for individuals only, if that helps. So individuals meaning unaccompanied adults.
Okay. Well, being that you're limited to chronic, then a lot of this is not going to apply, because people who are imminently losing their housing are by definition not yet in a shelter. They're not living on the street, so they're not going to qualify as chronic. People fleeing domestic violence who aren't otherwise in a shelter, if they're, say, staying with family members, for instance, they can't be considered chronic because, again, they're not in a shelter and they're not living on the street in a place not meant for human habitation. And the third category, where people who are homeless under other federal statutes, and there's a bunch of them in the list, and I don't know them all by heart, but it generally, some of those will apply, because some of those do include, living on the street or in places not meant for human habitation or being in shelters. So you'd have to kind of look at those individually to see which ones apply and which don't. But I guess the short answer is that a lot of these are not going to apply to your program because it's a chronic-only program. So.
And the other question that came in then was, has there been any discussion on the federal level about allowing the new homeless definitions to be used in current SPC contracts?
Not sure what they mean by current SPC contracts. Again, it depends on whether the program, is under contract and whether it's in renewal status or not. If it's still in its first 5 years, none of this is going to apply. As to whether there's been discussion on the federal level, I don't know.
The clarification here is not in renewal, so it'd be within those first 5 years, I would guess.
Oh, then I would say no. That's the way HUD has always kind of worked these changes, is that they generally don't apply to grants that are not in renewal status, because the idea is that when you applied under certain conditions and your grant term is for 5 years, if it's shelter plus care, and so all those conditions are going to remain the same throughout those 5 years. So I do tend to doubt they're going to allow the new, unless the next NOFA changes that, which it might well, and they have that ability to just kind of make these changes in the NOFAs without making federal regs. I don't think that change is going to happen.
So not likely to make them retroactive for those in the first 5 years.
I don't think so. No.
All right. Request for clarification. People in categories 2, 3, or 4 are not eligible for the SHP permanent housing and the shelter plus care programs.
They are not. No. And it came as a surprise, because we have been telling people for years that these changes would apply to shelter plus care, and then it was a little more than a footnote that said that because of the language in the 2011 NOFA, and I believe the screen cited that section of the 2011 NOFA that says this, that these particular programs can only serve people in these conditions, and so all these new conditions don't apply retroactively. They only apply to what it said in the NOFA. So now, we don't know whether that will change with the next NOFA or not, or whether it will ever change. It's hard to say.
And another one, when you talk about buildings not meant for habitation, does this also include buildings unfit for human habitation?
HUD says that substandard housing is not considered, living in substandard housing is not considered homelessness. That hasn't changed as far as I know. What constitutes substandard housing is a bit of a gray area. The way I've always handled that in our programs is it has to be, a building that is about to be condemned by a city government if you're living in that building, I'd say yes, you're homeless. A building with no utilities connected, and which also is structurally deficient to the extent that the elements are coming in and it has vermin infestations, I count that as a place not meant for human habitation. But it has to me, it kind of has to have all those components. No utilities and no longer structurally sound together. But that's kind of been our program's call. HUD's never really explained that, specifically. They just say substandard housing is not homelessness. Okay, the other two main qualifications, of course, for shelter plus care, the applicant has to have a disability. That doesn't mean they have to be getting disability from Social Security. It just means that they meet criteria that are established in our application. And I should say that we don't have the only shelter plus care programs in the state of Missouri. There are a few others in Joplin, Columbia, and I think Springfield, for instance. And they may handle that disability determination differently than we do. Our application just states how HUD defines the definition, and we ask persons who are credentialed or licensed to make such determinations to sign off on that form. That's how we do disability determination. And the income threshold is the applicant or household must have no more than 50% of the area median income as established by HUD. Those specific amounts vary from county to county, continuum to continuum, and they're available on HUD's website, and they get updated every year. So, to apply for our shelter plus care programs, our application is on our website, which you'll see here in a couple of minutes. Applications need to come through mental health service provider agencies. Those can either be Department of Mental Health itself or agencies contracted with the department to provide mental health services. And by mental health, I do mean developmental disability services, mental illness services, and substance abuse services. Those are our three categories. We also do take applications from persons who have AIDS or HIV infection. We also have them in our program as well. We also do occasionally do memoranda of understanding with nonprofits to submit applications to our program. That's based on their ability to provide services, of course, long-term for clients, and also ability to put a value on the services they provide. That's something we have to get from those agencies because we need to report those values to HUD on an annual basis. So, and of course, we want you to complete the entire application. You can always contact our office if there are any questions. We periodically have to revise the application, so it's best to check our website before you submit an application just to make sure you have the right one. And on the screen here, we've got just a little flow chart of the process we follow, and from the point of a person being homeless and applying to getting them housed in our program. The individual applies through either, again, a mental health provider, the Department of Mental Health itself, or community service providers. The application comes to our office in Jefferson City and is reviewed, and a determination of eligibility is made. We use a waitlist process for each continuum of care, and wait time depends or varies greatly depending on the location. I know right now in Kansas City, which I work with, the wait time is pretty long, like 2 years. St. Louis, maybe about a year. Smaller towns could be much less. It just depends on where it is. So it's a good idea to contact us to find out maybe what the wait time is before you apply, if that's a factor. So once we approve and the person is on the top of the wait list and we have the funding to approve that person, we forward their application to what we call our processing centers. We've got them all over the state. They're mostly housing authorities and community action agencies. And those agencies locally handle intake into the program. They provide all the paperwork. They do housing quality inspections. They work with landlords. They're your local go-to agencies. And again, that's all on our website. And once they go through that process, the applicant has a certain amount of time to look for their own rental housing the way any of us would do so. They go to a landlord. They say, I want to rent to you. an agreement is reached. It's all up to those parties at that point. So how this is shaping up for the future? As far as the homeless definition, we don't know. We don't have a crystal ball as far as what HUD is thinking. In the next NOFA, which may come out, we're thinking maybe in September, they may say, okay, all 4 categories now apply to permanent housing, but we don't know that. It may be their intention to forever and ever exclude these categories from permanent housing. We don't know. We'll certainly let you know once we know. And of course, we have, as I said, we have 40 shelter bus care grants, and a lot of those are in renewal status, and a lot of them are not, because we pretty much continually apply for new grants. So I think about maybe a dozen or so are not in renewal status, along with a number of chronic-only grants. So for those grants, they're not currently eligible for any application of any new definition as it stands now. But as time goes by, they will achieve renewal status, and then that will apply to them. And as we apply for new programs, and we have 4 pending right now that we're waiting to hear from HUD about, and this goes for anybody. If you're in the next NOFA, if you're going to apply for a new program, that program will be subject to the new definition of homelessness to the extent I've covered. If it's a permanent housing program, it's going to be subject to what it can be, Category 1. If it's one of the other ones I mentioned, it could be subject to all 3 of the categories. It just depends on what it is and, the fact that it'll be a new program. And that's basically it. That was for questions at the end, or if there are any other questions, certainly feel free. This is all our contact information. At the very under the phone numbers, that's our main website. It's pretty easy to remember. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the email address, housing@dmh.mo.gov. The website is right below there. Easiest thing to remember is just dmh.mo.gov/housing. I personally maintain the website, so if anybody has any suggestions for changes or improvements, feel free to let us know. We also do a blog called Missouri Housing Matters. That's missourihousingmatters.blogspot.com. And below are the contact information for everybody in our staff. So,
yeah, I would encourage anybody that has any further questions, go ahead and send them in right now. And while we're pausing to see if any more pop into our box here, encourage anybody that's interested in CEUs to click on the Purchase CEUs link underneath the video window here, and those will be made available to you that way. And also a reminder that there's a registration button for the Department of Mental Health Spring Training Institute underneath the video window as well. If you're having trouble reading the contact information on that slide, it doesn't always come through across the web as clearly. Those slides in the PDF format are available, and it's crystal clear in that PDF file. And you get everybody's email addresses and send Liz a congratulatory note. And also the link to those slides will be made available to you in the follow-up email. I believe that I have stalled long enough, and I don't see any more questions coming into the box.
Okay.
So, Dirk, thank you so much for your time. Folks, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
As I said, there's probably going to be more in this series of the transformation as they wrap up the transformation project, and so stay tuned to the website. We'll send you a follow-up email with a link to an evaluation. You can evaluate the program today and also provide the rest of the information that you were looking for. And from this point on, then, I'll just say thanks, Dirk, for your time and your expertise and for stepping in today. And, folks, thanks for joining us today.
Are we off camera?